A single footstep in the fog can seal a man's fate. Will Holmes uncover the truth before it's too late? Welcome to Sherlock Mystery. I am your host, Thornby. Your comments make this even better. Where are you watching from today? I can't wait to see where everyone is tuning in from. Let's dive in. It was on a particularly dense November evening in the year of our Lord, 1891, that I found myself once more summoned to 221 B. Baker Street, the hearth of so many enigmas and the stage of Sherlock Holmes's most astonishing feats of intellect. The fog hung low over the gas-lit streets of London like a sodden veil, muffling the clatter of hansoms and rendering every figure a lurking shadow. I had scarcely entered the sitting room when I observed Holmes standing in his dressing gown by the window, his sharp profile outlined in the glow of the single lamp burning behind him. "Ah, Watson," he murmured without turning. "Do come in. Your boots announce you, of course, but it was the cadence of your cough that settled it. Tea?" "Thank you," I replied, shedding my greatcoat and drawing nearer to the fire. "You summoned me with some urgency?" Holmes nodded, his eyes still fixed on the hazy panes. "Indeed. We are to receive a visitor. A most peculiar case, Watson, one that arrived not by letter, telegram, or even through Scotland Yard, but via a report from an ill-tempered night constable and a frightened widow who claims to have heard footsteps. Impossible ones." "Footsteps?" "In the fog, yes. But not just any footsteps. Ones that circled her house thrice, stopped at her door, and vanished. Vanished. Utterly. No trace in the garden mud. No marks beyond the gate. And the sound, Watson, she swears it echoed even after silence should have reigned. A phantom pace, as it were." I was about to inquire further when a sharp knock at the door interrupted us. Holmes flicked a glance at the clock. It was precisely 7. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later to usher in a small, wiry man wrapped in an oilskin coat, his policeman's helmet held respectfully in hand. "Inspector Gibbs, sir," he said in a voice that betrayed both hesitation and a touch of fear. "From the Stepney district." "Good evening, Inspector," Holmes said, gesturing to the armchair opposite him. "I understand you were the first to investigate Mrs. Margaret Beckett's report last night." "That's right, sir. And I wouldn't have bothered you, but, well, it weren't natural. Not the sort of thing a man forgets. I've been patrolling those streets near Limehouse for 6 years, and I never heard anything like it." "Describe the scene," Holmes said, steepling his fingers. Gibbs took a deep breath. "It was close to midnight. The fog was thick, thicker than usual, sir, like wading through milk. I was walking my round near Anchor Lane when I heard a scream. Not loud, just sharp. Frightened. I followed it to the Beckett home. Mrs. Beckett, she's a widow, lives alone since her husband drowned at Tilbury last year." He paused to wipe his brow. "She was pale as chalk, sir. Said she'd heard footsteps around the house. Slow, measured. She looked through the peephole. Nobody there, but she heard them again. This time, closer, and then silence." "She opened the door?" Holmes asked, leaning forward. "She did. Said the noise had stopped right at her doorstep. But when she stepped out, there weren't no one in sight. I checked the yard myself. Not a mark. No mud disturbed. And, sir, it had been raining earlier that day. There should have been prints." "Unless," Holmes murmured, "the one responsible took measures to conceal them." "That's what I thought," Gibbs said. "But here's the thing. The gate was still latched from the inside, no sign of a struggle. And yet the sound of those footsteps, she wasn't imagining it. I heard them myself as I stood there talking to her. Just once more. 3 slow steps, no shadow, then gone. Even I felt a shiver then, though the fire roared behind me." "And no witnesses?" I asked. "Neighbors?" "None that came forward. It's a quiet corner. The fog muffled everything." Holmes stood abruptly and began pacing the room, his dressing gown swishing as he turned on his heel. "A widow. Footsteps heard but never seen. A vanished presence in the night, and a gate latched from within. Curious? Tell me, Inspector, did Mrs. Beckett ever mention receiving visitors at odd hours? No, sir. Keeps to herself mostly. I asked her that directly. And the late Mr. Beckett, was he well liked? Gibbs shifted in his seat. Hard to say. Drowned in the docks during a brawl. Word was he was involved in smuggling. Nothing proven, though. He did have a partner, one Henry Lovelace, who disappeared soon after the inquest. Holmes stopped pacing. Disappeared? Vanished. No trace since January. Holmes's eyes glittered. Ah. Watson, we must visit Limehouse. Tonight? I said, startled. In this weather? There is no other time to catch a ghost, Watson, than while the fog still walks. He turned to Gibbs. Inspector, you will arrange a discreet escort for Dr. Watson and myself. No wagons, no announcements. I wish to see the Beckett residence as it stood during the incident. Can you manage this? Gibbs nodded, clearly relieved to pass the burden. Of course, sir. As the inspector rose and prepared to depart, Holmes remained by the window, watching the mist thicken once more. I rose, buttoned my coat, and fetched my revolver. You think this is more than a superstition? I asked as we made ready to leave. I think, Watson, Holmes said with that maddening calm of his, that someone is counting on it being just that. And with that, we vanished into the London fog. The fog had not lifted in the slightest when we stepped from the hansom cab onto Anchor Lane. The air carried that damp chill peculiar to London's riverfront, and our boots sank slightly into the yielding earth with every step. Lantern light pooled weakly at intervals, casting long, quivering shadows against the brick facades of the sleeping houses. Holmes, his collar turned high and hands gloved, strode ahead of me in complete silence, his sharp eyes scanning the gloom as though he might discern more in its depths than the human eye could possibly allow. The Beckett residence stood near the end of the lane, a narrow two-story affair with a bowed upper window and peeling white shutters. A low iron gate marked the boundary of a small garden patch, now turned to mud and muck. Constable Gibbs had arranged for no crowd nor patrol to meet us, as instructed. The house loomed solitary in the fog. Mrs. Margaret Beckett, a frail woman in her early 60s with thinning grey hair and a shawl clasped tightly over her chest, greeted us with the air of one both anxious and relieved. Her eyes darted behind us nervously, as though the fog itself harbored some lingering menace. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a voice thin with worry. "I'm grateful beyond words. I've barely slept. I can still hear it." Holmes offered a courteous nod. "You were quite right to send for help, madam. Please, if you would allow us to examine the premises as they were last night, unchanged." She nodded quickly. "I haven't stepped outside since. Haven't touched a thing." Holmes gave me a glance, then stepped forward and knelt just past the threshold, his magnifying lens appearing from his pocket in a flash. The wooden doorstep was damp, but bore no marks. Holmes ran his finger gently along the edge where stone met soil. No trace of scraping. No dust displaced. Watson, observe, no smudge at all where a boot should have struck in entering or departing. I crouched beside him and found it so. The earth was sodden, yet smooth. Holmes rose and began a slow circuit of the small front garden, his eyes sweeping the wall, the iron gate, the border hedges. When he reached the gate, he inspected the latch, then knelt to peer at its underside with a soft whistle. "Recently oiled," he murmured. Mrs. Beckett, watching anxiously from the doorway, wrung her hands. "I never oil it, sir. Not in months. It creaks terribly, always has." Holmes exchanged a look with me, then withdrew a clean white handkerchief and delicately ran it beneath the gate's hinge. "No dirt, only residue," he said. "Someone came prepared, Watson. A practiced hand." They moved silently, masked the creak, and avoided all traceable contact with the ground. I frowned. But why the performance? Why not enter if entry was their goal? Holmes turned toward Mrs. Beckett. "Madame, you say your husband was lost in a brawl at the docks?" She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Did he ever speak of associates? Partners? There was Henry Lovelace, she said with effort. They worked the Thames together for years. But I never liked him, always looking behind his shoulder, too many whispers at night when he visited. And when did he disappear? Soon after the inquest. Weeks, maybe. Holmes nodded, turned to me, and said quietly, "Watson, we must examine the interior. Particularly the back." We followed Mrs. Beckett inside. The home was modest but tidy, the walls adorned with old maritime paintings and a single portrait of a stern-faced man I took to be the late Mr. Beckett. Holmes moved with quiet purpose, examining the locks, the windows, and then pausing at the kitchen door, which led into the garden. "Was this latched last night?" "Yes," she said, "bolted and locked." Holmes undid it carefully and stepped outside. The rear garden was little more than a stone path and a shed, overgrown with creeping ivy. He crouched near the base of the shed and examined something with great care, then rose and returned to me. "Scrapings on the stone," he said softly. "And the faintest indentation. Look." He pointed to the edge of a flagstone where a very shallow imprint could be seen, almost imperceptible. "That," Holmes murmured, "is from a rubber-tipped cane." "A cane?" "Yes, a heavy one, but wielded cautiously. And now, Watson, let us return to the front." When we re-entered the parlor, Holmes surprised both Mrs. Beckett and myself by sitting calmly and requesting tea. His gaze was sharp but inward, calculating. When the tea was served, he stirred his without drinking and turned again to our hostess. "Mrs. Beckett, forgive my directness. Your husband's death, was it truly accidental?" She froze. I believed so. That's what the papers said." "But what do you believe?" There was a long silence. Then she whispered, "He had enemies. I think someone wanted him gone." Holmes nodded gravely. "One final question. Did your husband ever mention a ledger or any record he kept hidden?" She blinked, startled. "Yes. He had a leather-bound book, always kept under the floorboard in the parlor. But after he died, I couldn't find it. I assumed it went missing at the docks." Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. "Watson, we are dealing with a man who returned not to frighten, but to search." "For the ledger?" "Precisely. He came with stealth, oiled the gate, moved with care. But he did not search last night. He listened." "Listened?" "Yes, for whether someone else had found it." He turned to Mrs. Beckett. "Madam, I advise you to spend the night with relatives if possible. Someone will return tonight. Of that I am certain." She agreed without hesitation. Holmes assured her he would keep a discreet watch. As we departed into the deepening fog, I turned to him. "You suspect Lovelace? Perhaps, or someone connected to him. But Watson, note the cane." "Yes? Only a man certain he'd be unseen would leave that behind. Someone who knew the fog would mask all, and someone who knew this house intimately." Holmes lit a cigarette. "Tonight, we return here. Not to investigate further, but to wait, and when the footsteps come again, we shall meet them." He drew his coat tightly around him as the street disappeared into grey silence once more. The fog had thickened by the time we returned to Anchor Lane that evening. It clung to every lamp-post and railing like mildew from the underworld, swallowing light and rendering distance meaningless. Holmes had insisted we enter on foot, keeping our approach discreet and well before midnight. Mrs. Beckett, true to her word, had vacated the house. We let ourselves in with a key she had pressed into Holmes's palm, our movements hushed as we stepped into the silent parlor. Holmes was methodical in preparing the trap. He adjusted the wick of a single lamp to cast long, flickering shadows across the room, while leaving the corners steeped in gloom. Then he opened the window just slightly, allowing the chill fog to drift inside. He extinguished all but that one source of light and set a chair opposite the front door, half obscured by a standing screen. It was behind this screen that he directed me to sit, revolver in hand but hidden beneath my coat. "I doubt violence will be necessary," he whispered, crouched beside the hearth, his eyes already glittering in the dimness. "But our visitor may spook easily. Observe carefully and speak not a word. And you? I shall be elsewhere. The house offers several blind angles. If you hear a sound behind you, do not move. It will be me." With that, he disappeared into the gloom, leaving me with only the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant creak of boards beneath the fog-soaked rafters. Time passed, slow and muffled, until the rhythm of the night dulled my senses and made every floorboard crack seem magnified. And then, just before 1 o'clock, it happened. 3 slow steps. Deliberate, as though someone walked on air just outside the front door. I leaned forward slightly, pulse quickening. The steps came again, closer this time, softer, as if upon carpet, though I knew there was only stone beyond that threshold. A shadow flickered briefly at the frosted glass of the window, then silence. I heard the latch click. The front door opened an inch, then 2. No figure entered. Instead, the footsteps moved sideways, along the front of the house. Toward the window. A pause, and then something incredible. A faint tap, as of a cane striking wood, once, twice against the side of the frame. I dared not breathe. The footsteps resumed, retreating, no faster, no louder, until they disappeared into the fog. Then silence once more. Moments later, I felt a presence behind me. "Holmes." "Come," he whispered. "Out the back." He was already moving, swift and silent as a cat. I followed, boots muffled by felt pads he'd fastened earlier. We slipped through the rear garden, moving in parallel with the alley that curved around toward the street. Holmes paused near the edge of a crumbling wall and held up a hand. A figure emerged from the mist, tall, cloaked, leaning on a thick cane with a rubber tip. The face was obscured by a scarf and bowler. The man stopped at the front gate, cast one glance back down the lane, then entered once again. Holmes moved instantly. We came up behind the figure before he could shut the door, and Holmes reached forward, not to seize him, but to whisper in his ear with chilling calm. A ghost should not carry the scent of petroleum jelly. The man froze. Slowly, he turned, revealing a sharp, hawk-like face beneath the hat. His eyes were quick, calculating, and devoid of fear. "Mr. Lovelace, I presume?" Holmes said. The man hesitated. "Who are you?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. You've been searching for something?" Lovelace's lips thinned. "I've done nothing unlawful. You've entered private property without consent, under the cover of fog, and made calculated efforts to mask your presence. Would you care to explain why?" "Not without a constable present," he said, but there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. Holmes smiled coldly. "Ah, but there is one. Watson, our good friend Inspector Lestrade, is waiting just at the end of the lane. Shall we walk?" For a moment I feared the man might bolt, but he surprised me. He sighed and stepped fully inside the parlor, shutting the door behind him. "Very well," he said, "but I want the truth told." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "You are looking for the ledger," Holmes said, not as a question. Lovelace nodded once. James Beckett kept a record. Every bribe, every illicit cargo, every corrupt official who helped us move smuggled goods upriver without inspection. He kept it as insurance in case things turned. "And they did," Holmes said softly. "He was killed." "Drowned," Lovelace said. "But not by accident. Someone pushed him into the water. I don't know who. After the inquest, I went looking for the ledger. It wasn't at the dockhouse. I came here. I thought Margaret might have hidden it." "And why the theatrics?" Lovelace rubbed his forehead. I didn't want to scare her, but I needed to know if she had it. If someone else was already watching her, I thought if I made her uneasy, she might tip her hand. I listened for conversation, for movement, but every time she was alone. You never searched inside? I couldn't risk it. I knew Beckett had enemies. I thought someone else might be looking too. Holmes studied him for a long moment. And they are? Lovelace looked up, startled. Holmes turned to me. Watson, the clue we overlooked was the oil on the gate. Someone else had oiled it before Lovelace. He heard the footsteps too, and mirrored them, hoping to flush the true hunter into the open. Lovelace paled slightly. You aren't the only one after that ledger, Mr. Lovelace, Holmes continued, and your behavior has brought you into full view. From this moment forward, I advise you to keep very still, until I find the man who killed Beckett, and whoever wants the ledger badly enough to kill again. Lovelace swallowed, then gave a curt nod. I'll stay out of it. Holmes straightened. Too late for that, I fear. Outside, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing the shimmer of dawn on the horizon. Holmes walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, and gazed into the mist. Tonight, Watson, he said quietly, we discovered not one shadow in the fog, but two. He turned, and his eyes gleamed with a resolve I knew all too well. One of them, he said, is willing to wait. The other is ready to strike. The faint gold of morning had begun to seep into the fog when Holmes and I escorted Henry Lovelace through the mist-slicked streets to a quiet constable's post just off Cable Street. Inspector Lestrade, summoned earlier by Holmes through a message relayed via Gibbs, awaited us with his usual mixture of exasperation and deference, adjusting his cravat with all the weariness of a man drawn from bed before breakfast. You're keeping interesting company, Holmes, Lestrade muttered as Lovelace was quietly led to a holding room for questioning. You'll forgive me if I'm not delighted to see another dockman with a cloudy past. On the contrary, Lestrade, Holmes replied coolly, this particular dockman may have just saved us time. The question now is whether he knows more than he's letting on, or less than he believes. Lestrade squinted at him. So the ledger's real? Oh, it's real. And judging by the careful silence surrounding it, it contains names no man would want to see made public. Criminals. Not exclusively. Holmes's expression was unreadable. But anyone who touches it risks being the next body pulled from the Thames. I'll need access to Beckett's effects, whatever was recovered after his death. You think the ledger might have been on him? I think he hid it well before his demise. But I also think he knew someone was closing in. A dying man with secrets tends to conceal more than he reveals. We departed shortly thereafter, returning to Baker Street for several hours of rest and reflection. Holmes, ever the machine in moments of crisis, paced the room in his dressing gown while I dozed fitfully in the armchair. At 10:30, he halted mid-stride and snapped his fingers. Watson, the portrait. I blinked awake. The portrait? In the Beckett home, over the hearth. Did you notice anything peculiar? I rubbed my eyes. Only that it was somewhat crooked. Precisely. Yet the nail was firm, a trivial detail, but one that nagged at me. Suppose it wasn't hung by accident? Suppose the tilt concealed something beneath it? He rang for Mrs. Hudson and requested a light breakfast and a cab at once. We returned to the Beckett residence with all speed, where Holmes proceeded directly to the portrait. With a gloved hand, he lifted it from the wall. A small rectangular cavity had been carved into the plaster behind it, empty now, but unmistakably designed to conceal a slim object. A thin line of dust clung to the ledge, save for the center. It was here, Holmes murmured. Recently removed. By Lovelace? He shook his head. He wouldn't have come inside. And we searched the house after he was taken. No ledger. Someone else has it. Then who? Someone who entered either before our watch or immediately after. I felt a sudden chill. You mean someone watched us watching? Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, a third player. Just then, the door creaked open behind us, and Constable Gibbs stepped in, removing his helmet with an apologetic glance. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes. There's a woman downstairs, says she has information about Beckett. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Send her up, Holmes said. Moments later, a young woman of perhaps 25 entered the room, visibly nervous but determined. She wore a faded green shawl, her hands clenched around a rolled envelope. Her eyes darted from Holmes to me, then back. My name's Ada Merrick, she said. I used to clean for Mr. Beckett. He never said much, but he trusted me. The night before he died, he gave me this and said if anything happened to him, I was to give it to Mr. Holmes of Baker Street. Took me a while to find you. Holmes stepped forward and took the envelope with great care. It was unsealed but tightly wrapped. He unfurled it upon the writing desk and studied the contents. It was a map, hand-drawn, smudged in places, but unmistakably the layout of Limehouse Wharf. A red X had been marked just beyond the last mooring platform. Beside it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Beneath the third piling, low tide only." Extraordinary, Holmes whispered. Watson, Beckett hid the ledger in a location submerged by tide. Clever man. And risky, I said. Anyone watching him might have seen. Holmes turned to Miss Merrick. Did Beckett seem afraid, Miss Merrick? Not afraid, she replied. But resigned. Like he knew something was closing in and he couldn't stop it. Holmes offered her a rare, warm nod. You've done a brave thing, Miss Merrick. Return home at once and speak of this to no one. Your name will not be mentioned. Once she had departed, Holmes turned to me. We go now, Watson. Tide charts show a retreat this morning just before noon. We'll have perhaps 30 minutes before the water creeps back. By the time we arrived at Limehouse Wharf, the tide had receded enough to expose a slick rim of stone and mud along the pilings. The docks were nearly deserted, save for a handful of men working at crates on the far side. Holmes made his way to the third piling with feline grace, crouching at its base while I kept watch. After several minutes of probing the dark crevice with a small metal rod, he gave a soft grunt of satisfaction. A moment later, he extracted a waxed oilcloth bundle from the crevice. The ledger, even wrapped, its weight and shape were unmistakable. Holmes did not open it then. Instead, he concealed it inside his coat and motioned for us to depart with haste. As we reached the end of the dock, he slowed. Across the quay stood a man in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat. He stood perfectly still, hands in pockets, watching us without expression. As our eyes met, he turned silently and vanished into the maze of alleyways beyond. Holmes said nothing, but his jaw had set. That, I ventured, wasn't coincidence. No, Holmes replied. He followed Ada Merrick here. He's been watching all of us. The hunter has shown his face at last. We returned to Baker Street in grim silence. Only once we were safely within did Holmes unseal the oilcloth. Inside was the ledger, 43 pages of dense handwriting, names, sums, dates, and locations. Holmes scanned it quickly, then turned to me. Beckett wasn't the only one in danger. Watson, there are men in this book, judges, officers, men of Parliament. If this ever became public, half the city's scaffolding would collapse. And someone's willing to kill to keep that from happening. Holmes nodded. Or perhaps, to make sure it does happen. He closed the book and lit a cigarette. We're no longer chasing a murderer, Watson. We're standing between a secret and the man who means to bury it with corpses. The ledger lay between us on the desk at Baker Street, its brittle spine cracked from moisture but its contents meticulously preserved. The ink was faded in places, but the script, Beckett's own, remained legible and damning. Holmes, his brow drawn in intense concentration, turned each page with care, occasionally making a low hum of acknowledgement, as though ticking invisible boxes in a list only he could see. I stood behind him, arms crossed, peering over his shoulder. "Have you found a pattern?" I asked at last. "More than a pattern, Watson. A structure." Beckett didn't merely record transactions. He categorized them. There are distinct symbols beside each entry: a dagger, a crown, a balance scale, a cross, all meticulously used, never mixed. Observe this page. 5 entries all marked with a crown. These names, at a glance, are tied to minor nobility or peerage. He tapped a page further along. This grouping, all marked with a dagger, concerns known criminals, smugglers, enforcers, and here, scales beside every name, customs officials, revenue inspectors, even a magistrate. I leaned in, struck by the implications. Beckett was mapping the rot, an entire network. Precisely. And whoever now hunts this ledger does not do so merely for self-preservation. If this fell into the hands of a blackmailer or a revolutionary, it could bring down institutions. Holmes shut the book carefully, then rose and walked to the window, staring out at the fog beginning to lift over Baker Street. We must assume our opponent has resources, connections. He moved with confidence last night because he was assured of secrecy. But secrecy is no longer his ally. I remained silent, watching him think. "He'll act soon," Holmes continued, "and with urgency. We've upset the balance. If the ledger were to vanish, all leverage would be lost. If it were exposed, chaos. What shall we do with it then?" Holmes turned. "For now, we protect it. But we must learn who among these names feared Beckett enough to have him killed, and who has the most to lose if that death is traced back." As if on cue, a sharp knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, bearing a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it, scanned it briefly, and his eyes narrowed. "From Lestrade. Lovelace has been attacked, inside the constable's post." "What?" He survived. "Barely. Slashed across the ribs by a man posing as a medical inspector. The assailant fled before he could be identified. But it confirms our suspicions, Watson. Someone is already tying up loose ends." We were at the constable's post within the hour. Lovelace lay on a cot, bandaged and pale, eyes fluttering beneath a layer of sweat. Lestrade stood nearby, arms folded, jaw tight. "No guards were harmed," he muttered. "He just walked in, showed papers, fake, we now know, and said he needed to check on Lovelace's condition before transfer. Then he struck. We're lucky he didn't finish the job." Holmes examined the bandages but said nothing of the wounds. Instead, he sat beside Lovelace and leaned in. "You must tell me who knew about the ledger, outside of Beckett and yourself." Lovelace winced. "There was one. Jasper Horn, used to be Beckett's solicitor, only man Beckett trusted with legal matters. But I always thought he was more than just legal muscle. Knew too much." "Where does he keep offices?" "Clerkenwell, near Saffron Hill. But Holmes, he's dangerous, more than you know." Holmes nodded once. "Rest. You're safer here than anywhere else. For the moment." Outside the room, Lestrade fell in step with us. "This Horn," Holmes answered with absolute certainty. "He's our third shadow. If anyone could decipher Beckett's intentions from afar, it's a solicitor with a criminal's instincts. He would have motive, means, and access." "I'll send men." "No," Holmes said. "Not yet. If we confront him now, he will vanish, and with him, any hope of tracing the ledger's broader implications." "You want him watched?" "Precisely. Quietly. We'll call on him in person, and soon, but not before I gather more from the ledger. There's a trail here, Lestrade, and I intend to follow it." We returned to Baker Street as evening fell, the air heavy with the first stirrings of winter. Holmes resumed his study of the ledger, isolating specific names and cross-referencing them with previous cases, court reports, and even his personal files. At one point he rose and retrieved from a drawer a thick sheaf of documents, old police notices and private correspondence. "Here," he said, pointing to an annotated letter. "Sir Langley Rusk. He was investigated 4 years ago for embezzlement in the Port Authority, but never charged. Beckett's ledger lists payments to him every 3rd month, always under the symbol of the crown." "A nobleman on the take," I said grimly. "More than that. He facilitated untaxed goods through royal contracts, and this name beneath his Father Alban Stone, churchman, former rector of St. Jude's in Whitechapel, disappeared under murky circumstances and resurfaced in the colonies." He flipped to another page. "And here, Charles Chew, retired judge, once ruled on a smuggling case involving Lovelace and Beckett. Acquitted them both. Beckett paid him 6 months later." Holmes circled the entry. "That, Watson, is a bribe disguised as gratitude." As the clock chimed 10, Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. "Each name in this book is a door, and each door opens into a room filled with shadows. But if we follow the right sequence, one of those doors will reveal our murderer." "Jasper Horn?" I asked. "He is the hinge, but the hand that turned it may be someone far more entrenched, perhaps someone who saw in Beckett's death not just the silencing of a risk, but an opportunity to claim the ledger for themselves." He rose and crossed to the fireplace, resting one hand upon the mantel. "Tomorrow we call on Mr. Horn, not as accusers, but as men seeking answers. He will underestimate us if he believes we're ignorant of the ledger's contents. That," he said, tapping the side of his temple, "will be our advantage." "And the man in the hat?" I asked. "He'll be watching," Holmes replied. "Let us hope he watches closely enough to reveal what he intends next." The flames danced in the grate as Holmes fell into contemplative silence, the room thick with unspoken possibilities. I sat by the window, staring into the street, wondering just how deep the rot had gone, and how many were willing to kill to keep it buried. The morning was crisp and grey, with a sheen of dew on the window panes as Holmes and I set out for Clerkenwell. Our destination, the office of Jasper Horn, solicitor, once an associate of the late James Beckett, and now, as Holmes suspected, the pivotal figure around whom the shadows gathered. The fog had retreated, but the streets still bore the quiet wariness of a city just beginning to stir after a troubled sleep. Holmes was silent throughout the cab ride, his gaze fixed out the window, his thoughts clearly, racing far ahead of our wheels. The offices of Horn and McKellen were housed in a narrow red-brick building that stood like a watchful sentinel among a row of shuttered tobacconists and dingy bookshops. A brass plaque announced the firm with austere modesty. We climbed a creaking staircase to the 2nd floor and were received by a secretary who, despite the early hour, seemed unruffled by our unexpected appearance. "Mr. Horn is presently engaged, sirs," she said, her voice crisp but wary. "Then inform him," Holmes replied, "that Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson require but 10 minutes of his time, and should he decline, I shall be forced to conclude his recent visitor last night was not, as he claims, a private courier, but something rather more criminal in nature." The woman blinked, only once, and disappeared into the inner office. Moments later, we were admitted. Jasper Horn rose from behind a large mahogany desk, tall and lean, his once black hair now touched with iron. His eyes, sharp and hooded, held none of the surprise one might expect at being confronted by a consulting detective first thing in the morning. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, gesturing to a pair of leather chairs, "and Dr. Watson, please sit. I can't say I'm delighted, but I am intrigued." Holmes remained standing. "We'll stand, thank you. You were once retained by James Beckett." Horn nodded. "Years ago, in shipping and property matters. Nothing irregular. And did he trust you? Trust is not a word solicitors traffic in, Mr. Holmes, but I believe I earned his confidence, such as it was. Enough to confide the existence of a ledger. There was no flicker of surprise on Horn's face, only a faint tightening of the mouth. That rumor has surfaced before. I dismissed it as nonsense. Then you'll be shocked to learn, Holmes said coolly, that the ledger not only exists, but is in our possession, and that it names you. At last, Horn reacted. He leaned forward slightly. Does it? Holmes stepped closer. We know you were paid to facilitate silent bribes to port authorities, that you drafted falsified documents, and that Beckett kept meticulous notes. We also know someone killed him, and we suspect you have an interest in ensuring that ledger never sees daylight. There was a pause, a long, pregnant pause, before Horn spoke again, this time more softly. I didn't kill him. Perhaps not, but you may know who did. Horn's hands steepled. I warned Beckett he was walking too close to the edge. He'd started keeping that book as insurance, yes, but it became more than that. He began to enjoy the power it gave him. Blackmail, threats, manipulation. It wasn't long before he was extorting the very people who once paid him. Holmes tilted his head. Including you? Yes, but not just me. Judges, officials, even a bishop, if I recall correctly. But I tell you again, Holmes, I didn't kill him. The last time I saw him, he was drunk and muttering about a new buyer. Someone from outside. A buyer. He never named them. Only said they had money and ambition, and that they wanted leverage on half of Whitehall. Holmes's expression darkened. And when was this? 4 days before he died. I leaned forward. And you never warned anyone? I thought he was bluffing. I thought it was more games. By then I was already stepping away from the whole arrangement. I wanted no part in a collapse. Holmes moved to the window. The man who attacked Lovelace. Was it the buyer? Possibly. Or the buyer's agent. Beckett made the mistake of keeping records. Someone else intends to own those records outright. If they haven't already attempted to steal them from you, Mr. Holmes, they soon will. There was something final in his tone, resigned, not threatening. Holmes turned back, studying him. If I find you lied, he said calmly, I'll turn that ledger over to the Yard and let them cross-examine your name off every page. Horn nodded solemnly. Then I suggest you guard it with your life, Mr. Holmes. We left the office in grim silence, the clang of the door behind us echoing like a gunshot down the hall. On the street, Holmes stopped suddenly. Watson. Yes. Did you note the dust on his windowsills? I can't say I did. Thick as soot, untouched for weeks. Yet he claimed Beckett visited 4 days before his death. I felt a chill. So he lied. About something, yes. Either Beckett never came, or Horn has another office he didn't tell us about. As we walked toward the nearest cab, Holmes was already 2 steps ahead. We returned to Baker Street, Watson. I want every directory entry on Horn and McKellen. If there's a second location, we'll find it. But we did not reach Baker Street. As our cab turned into the alley near Doughty Street, a second carriage shot across the intersection, too fast, too close. The horses screamed. Our driver swerved violently to avoid collision, and our cab tipped sharply. We were thrown aside in a rush of hooves and wheels. Pain shot through my shoulder as I struck the cobbles. Holmes rolled to his feet almost at once, ignoring the blood at his temple. The other carriage was already gone. Deliberate. Holmes stood still a moment, his face like granite. The ledger, Watson. Someone knew we had it, and someone meant to stop us. As I struggled upright, he extended a hand to help me. There will be another attempt. And the next one, he said grimly. We'll not miss. I felt the sharp ache in my shoulder for hours after, but Holmes paid no heed to his own wound, his mind already racing beyond the accident's violence. Our cabby, shaken but unhurt, righted his battered rig and insisted on carrying us as far as Baker Street, where Holmes pressed a generous coin into his palm and urged him to vanish for the remainder of the day. Inside, the fog of adrenaline began to clear, and I took stock of our position. "We cannot remain here," Holmes said, the moment the door was shut and bolted. "Not with the ledger in our possession and our enemies at large. Someone is watching us. Someone who knows our every move." "Do you think it was Horn?" I asked, examining the wound at his hairline. It was shallow, but bled enough to dampen his collar. Holmes pressed a handkerchief to it absently. "Horn is a liar, but I believe he fears exposure more than he desires blood. No, Watson, this was the buyer, the one Beckett mentioned, a new player and one who prefers to act through intermediaries. They would have made certain to intercept us, ledger in hand, before we could double back. Yet they failed, for now, which is why we must act while we have the advantage." Holmes crossed to the writing desk and drew out the ledger, tucking it deep into the lining of a heavy medical bag. "This will suffice for tonight's work. You will carry it, Watson. Even should I fall, you must see it to safety." His tone brooked no argument. I nodded, clutching the bag tightly. Holmes then drew a sheaf of notepaper toward him and began, with furious energy, to write a series of notes, each addressed to one of the names from Beckett's ledger: Sir Langley Rusk, Father Alban Stone, Charles Tew, and others. The language was spare, almost cryptic. "I have business concerning the late James Beckett. Meet me at the Blue Parrot, 10:30 tonight. Bring no one. S.H." When I inquired as to his purpose, Holmes replied, "A test, Watson. Whoever receives this note and declines, or fails to appear, narrows our field. Whoever comes may expose themselves through their words or actions. Desperation breeds mistakes." He dispatched me to the nearest telegraph office with the notes, instructing me to hire runners for the deliveries and to watch the street on my return. While I was away, Holmes dressed his wound and paced our rooms, refusing even a mouthful of tea from Mrs. Hudson, who wrung her hands and insisted we were inviting death upon ourselves. By 9 that night, Baker Street was shrouded in darkness. The only sound was the occasional crack of wheels in the lane and the distant call of a newspaper boy. Holmes checked his pocket watch and nodded to me. Time. We departed on foot, Holmes leading us by a circuitous route through alleys and arcades, doubling back twice to be certain we were not followed. The Blue Parrot was a notorious dockside tavern, a warren of smoke, cheap gin, and whispers. It was the sort of place where no questions were asked and none answered. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of ale and tobacco. Holmes selected a table in a corner, half in shadow, and set his back to the wall. I took the seat beside him, the medical bag at my feet. By 10:15, the tavern had begun to fill with men in dark coats, their faces pale and watchful under flickering gaslight. Sir Langley Rusk arrived first, noble-bearing and twitching moustache, betraying nerves he could not master. Soon after came Charles Tew, his limp more pronounced, his watery eyes darting from face to face. Last was Father Alban Stone, dressed plainly, yet there was a subtle menace about his quiet self-assurance. The three sat together at a table near ours, though they made no sign of recognition. At precisely past, the door swung open again. Jasper Horn entered, alone. He saw us instantly, but made no move to approach. Instead, he watched. Holmes waited until all were seated, then rose and crossed to the center of the room. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried. "Gentlemen, I trust you know why you are here. You each received a note concerning James Beckett and his ledger." An uneasy ripple passed among them. Rusk bristled. "If this is some form of blackmail, sir," Holmes cut him off. "No threats, only opportunity. The ledger exists and its contents implicate each of you in a conspiracy of long standing. You are here because you wish to know who holds the knife and who stands to be cut. Tew spoke, his voice reedy. And who holds it, Mr. Holmes? You? Holmes smiled. The ledger is safe, but you must decide. Work together or continue your private wars and risk all being ruined. A heavy silence fell. Holmes's eyes moved from man to man. You were all extorted by Beckett, Holmes went on, but not all of you wished him dead. Who here can say where they were the night of his murder? None answered. Rusk clenched his jaw. Stone looked down. Tew coughed into his hand. It was Father Stone who finally broke the tension. The real question, Mr. Holmes, is who stands to gain by Beckett's silence, not merely the end of extortion, but control of the ledger, and with it, every name in London's underworld. A shadow moved near the bar. Holmes's gaze flickered, then steadied. He stepped closer, voice low. Beckett's murderer is among you. You were all watched. Some of you even hired protection, fearing exposure, but the one who feared Beckett least, who perhaps even envied him, acted first. Suddenly, the room's energy changed. Horn stood, moving quickly to the door. Too quickly. Holmes blocked his path. You'll not leave yet, Horn. Sit. Rusk and Stone looked at each other, uncertainty giving way to suspicion. You have the most to lose, Horn, Holmes said. Not because you orchestrated this web, but because you underestimated Beckett. You were his confidant, but someone else turned you into a pawn. A gasp escaped Tew. Who? Holmes's eyes swept the room. Who indeed? Tonight, gentlemen, you will all remain here. Lestrade waits outside with his men. The first who runs will answer for Beckett's death. At that, the back door creaked. A figure slipped through the shadows, shorter, slighter than the others, but quick. Holmes moved like lightning, seizing the arm of a man dressed as a serving boy. He tore off the cap and scarf. Beneath them, gaunt and desperate, was Ada Merrick. You? I cried. She spat, struggling. He killed my father. Beckett ruined us all. I'll see you all rot. Holmes's face was grave as Lestrade burst in, officers at his heels. The true hand behind Beckett's death, this woman. The buyer used her, promised vengeance, and now she stands alone in the fog. Ada's eyes burned with tears, but she no longer resisted as the irons snapped shut. Holmes released her gently to Lestrade and turned to the gathered men. Your secrets may be safe for now, but tonight you have seen the price of silence and the cost of conspiracy. The fog may hide footsteps, gentlemen, but it cannot erase guilt. The room emptied, the silence hanging heavy. Holmes and I stepped out into the cold, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. Come, Watson. London is never more dangerous than when its ghosts walk free. We vanished into the night, leaving only questions in our wake. The clamor of the blue parrot faded as Holmes and I slipped into the mist-laden street, the shouts and confusion inside quickly drowned by the familiar hush of London's midnight hours. For several minutes, we walked in silence, each step muffled by the dampness underfoot. I sensed Holmes was turning over the events in his mind, analyzing the tangle of deceit and emotion that had so unexpectedly spilled forth. At last, he spoke, his voice low, but deliberate. You observed, Watson, how Miss Merrick's appearance threw the others into panic. Her confession was not merely an act of desperation, it was the final gambit of someone manipulated well beyond her means. I nodded, recalling the venom in Ada's eyes and the wild hope that had burned beneath her misery. You believe she was merely a pawn? In part, yes, but a pawn that almost upended the entire board. Consider, someone not only provided her with information about Beckett's ledger and movements, but coached her, supplied her with means, and timed her entry to coincide with our own confrontation. It was a masterstroke of orchestration, yet too clean, too convenient. Are you suggesting the real buyer is still at large? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. Precisely. Our enemy is too careful, too shadowed. They allowed Ada Merrick to play the role of avenger, to draw suspicion and emotion, while they themselves remained hidden. Tonight's events provided them with exactly what they wanted: chaos among Beckett's former associates and the removal of a troublesome intermediary. A hansom rolled past, horses snorting, the driver half asleep. Holmes drew me into a side street, the fog thickening around us. "We must move quickly, Watson. Lestrade will see Ada Merrick charged, but if we are correct, her involvement ends at Beckett's death. The one who guided her, who promised her retribution and escape, remains invisible. And as long as they have not retrieved the ledger, they are certain to act again." I gripped the medical bag tighter. "Holmes, should we not turn the ledger over to Lestrade at once?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. To do so would be to expose it to precisely those who have the power to bury or misuse its contents. No, Watson, we must set a final trap." As dawn crept in, we reached Baker Street. Holmes wasted no time spreading the ledger, the map from Ada, and his own notes across the table. His energy was relentless, almost feverish. "Think, Watson," he said. "What is the only thing our adversary does not know?" I thought for a moment. "The ledger's location." "Just so. And now we must allow them to think they know, and force their hand." He penned a brief note. "The ledger will be handed to Scotland Yard tomorrow at noon. Until then, it is kept in the vault at Langley's Bank, Cornhill. S.H." He sealed the note in an envelope and addressed it to Charles Tew, with instructions for a discreet runner to ensure it changed hands several times before delivery, thus guaranteeing the information would leak. "There," Holmes said, satisfied. "Within the day, every interested party will know where the ledger is said to be. They will have little time and much desperation. We must be at Langley's ourselves, quietly, hidden, and prepared for anything." I could not rest, nor could Holmes. That morning passed in tense anticipation, broken only by Mrs. Hudson's worried inquiries and the distant sounds of carts in the street. At 11:30, we took a cab to Cornhill, Holmes disguised as a bank clerk, myself as a modest manservant. Langley's was a stately institution, all brass and marble and silent footfalls. Holmes arranged with a bank manager, an old acquaintance, for us to use a private viewing room with a false deposit box, empty but for a ledger of blank pages. From the screened gallery above the lobby, we waited, watching the polished floor below, the great swinging doors, the comings and goings of customers and staff. At 10 minutes to noon, a subtle tension entered the hall. A tall man in a dove-grey coat appeared, moving with the confidence of someone for whom this charade was mere formality. Holmes nudged me. "Observe, Watson," the man in grey. "That is our buyer, or his agent." The man moved to the clerk at the vault. A brief, murmured conversation and a slip of paper exchanged. Then, with casual certainty, he stepped toward the private viewing rooms. Holmes and I descended quickly, following at a distance. We entered just in time to see the man rifling through the false ledger, his face twisting in confusion. Holmes slipped inside, quietly locking the door behind us. "Good morning, Mr. Horn," Holmes said, his voice as cold as the marble beneath our feet. Jasper Horn looked up, startled, his mask of calm failing him for the first time. "You, Holmes, what is this?" "A trap, Mr. Horn, and you have walked straight into it." Horn's hand darted inside his coat, but Holmes moved faster, seizing his wrist and producing a small revolver. "No more games. You orchestrated Beckett's murder, set Ada Merrick on a path of vengeance, and used the chaos to try to recover the ledger. You coached her, promised her justice, all while intending to keep the evidence and use it for your own leverage." For a moment, Horn's composure crumbled. "You have no proof." Holmes nodded to me. "I set the real ledger on the table. Your name appears more than any other, Horn, Holmes said, and every payment leads to you. Horn sagged, the fight draining from him. You don't understand. With that book I could have ruled London. Beckett was a fool. He blackmailed the weak. I would have used it to expose the powerful, to change things. Holmes's eyes were icy. No, you would have replaced one rot with another. That is not justice. Lestrade, alerted by Holmes, entered a moment later with 2 constables. They took Horn away without ceremony. His head bowed. Holmes closed the ledger at last and handed it to Lestrade. See that it reaches the right hands, and that those hands are watched. Back on the steps of the bank, Holmes and I paused, the city stretching before us in the clear midday light. The footsteps in the fog, Watson. Echoes of a crime, leading us through darkness to the truth. And the truth, as ever, is neither simple nor kind. He turned his collar up against the wind, the shadows already shrinking as the sun climbed higher. And so, my dear friend, another case concludes, not with triumph, but with the hard clarity of daylight. We walked away together, London alive and indifferent, the echoes of that foggy night already fading into memory. The city had shrugged off the fog at last, but the memory of those footsteps, unseen yet ever present, clung to my mind as Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street. The ledger, now secure in Lestrade's possession and guarded by the yard, had lost much of its immediate threat, but not its power. For Holmes, the end of a case never meant the end of thought, and I could tell he was not yet at ease, his face set in a peculiar expression of restless concentration. We entered our familiar sitting room to find a hush had settled there, the air heavy with both relief and the ghosts of what had been uncovered. I poured 2 cups of tea, but Holmes left his untouched, standing at the window, eyes fixed on the relentless tide of traffic below. I waited, knowing better than to press him when his mind was still sifting the last fragments of a case. At length he spoke, his tone pensive. There is a melancholy in such conclusions, Watson. Justice, as we have secured it, is rarely as clean or as satisfying as one might wish. Ada Merrick sits in a cell, her future uncertain. Horn will face trial, but the greater web of those named in Beckett's ledger, how many will truly be brought to account? I nodded, sharing his unease. Still, you have saved lives, exposed a network that might have done incalculable harm. He gave a small, humorless smile. Perhaps, but the darkness runs deep, and our work has merely shifted the shadows, not banished them. A soft knock interrupted our reverie. Mrs. Hudson bearing a note on a silver tray. Holmes read it quickly and handed it to me. It was from Lestrade. Horn in custody, Ada refusing counsel. The ledger has been locked away and will be presented as evidence. However, Rusk and Tew both deny all involvement, pressure mounting from above. Be wary. L. Holmes folded the note and slipped it into the fire. As I feared, Watson. Now that the danger is past, the powerful seek to close ranks and rewrite the story to suit themselves. He settled into his chair, steepling his fingers, his gaze distant. I wonder, Watson, do you recall the pattern of Ada Merrick's steps in the fog? 3 circuits of the house, her pause at the door, the retreat. She was imitating the ghostly threat that had so unsettled Mrs. Beckett, but more than that, she was signaling to someone watching. It was no random act. It was part of a design laid out by Horn, meant to panic, to flush out secrets, to lay claim to Beckett's legacy by sowing confusion. I found myself shivering, the weight of the events settling on my shoulders. Do you regret how it ended? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Regret? No, Watson. Regret implies the luxury of an alternate path. I see only the road that lay before us, the one that wound through fog and fear and ended as all roads must, in the sharp light of day. We did what we must, no more and no less. He stood abruptly and crossed to his violin, drawing the bow across the strings in a slow, contemplative phrase. The music lingered in the air, neither cheerful nor mournful, but curiously in between, as if reflecting the very ambiguity of the case itself. After a while, he lowered the violin. Ada Merrick will need an advocate, someone to see the truth in her actions, misguided as they were. As for Horn, the courts will judge him. But as for Beckett, the ledger, and the others, those ghosts will linger. There are always footsteps in the fog, Watson. Always a mystery waiting for the right ear to listen, the right mind to unravel it. I finished my tea and stood beside him at the window. London bustled below, indifferent to our efforts, yet somehow a little brighter in the clear light. "Holmes," I said, "I believe you have set more than one thing right. Perhaps not all, but more than most men ever do." He glanced at me, a shadow of warmth in his eyes. "That, my friend, is all we can aspire to." The rest of the day passed quietly. Letters arrived and went. Holmes kept to his armchair, deep in thought, and I took solace in my own reflections, grateful as ever to be in the company of a mind that could bring order from chaos. By evening, the city outside glimmered in gaslight, and the fog was only a memory. As I penned the final lines of my account, I found myself returning to that fateful night on Anchor Lane, to the footsteps heard in the mist, the secrets whispered and betrayed. The story had begun in darkness, but it ended, as all true stories must, with the faintest glimmer of hope, however fragile, however hard-won. Thus concluded another of Sherlock Holmes's most curious adventures, and in the hush of Baker Street, I could not help but feel the world itself, for a moment, held its breath, awaiting the next echo in the fog. That evening, as twilight washed London in a muted gold, Holmes and I sat side by side in the lamplight of Baker Street. The final ripples of the case still spread outward, Lestrade's telegrams arriving at intervals, each more fraught than the last, and Holmes's eyes tracing lines in the smoke above his pipe. For my part, I found myself haunted by Ada Merrick's trembling confession, the cold cunning of Jasper Horn, and the unyielding silence of the city's most powerful men. Yet amidst all this, life persisted with its customary indifference. Carriages rumbled in the street, the bells of St. Mary's chimed the hour, and Mrs. Hudson moved quietly below. As the fire settled, Holmes finally broke the hush. "You see, Watson, there are two kinds of justice in this world, the one written in law, which Lestrade and the courts now pursue, and the other that lurks in the cracks between men's hearts. A shadow justice, unspoken, invisible, but very real." I nodded. "You believe Ada's role will be understood?" Holmes regarded me, his expression neither optimistic nor bleak, but weighted with experience. Ada Merrick was, in the truest sense, a victim before ever she became an accomplice. There are those, myself included, who will see to it her part is not misconstrued. Horn's guilt is clear, but the rest, the names in Beckett's ledger, will slide back into the city's darkness. London protects her own secrets, Watson. A gust of wind rattled the panes, and I could almost imagine those footsteps again, echoing through the fog-bound alleys. Holmes rose and wandered to his chemical table, fussing with bottles and pipettes, ostensibly in pursuit of a forgotten experiment, but I recognized his restlessness. He worked best with his hands when his mind remained unsettled. "I must admit," I said, "I find myself turning over the details even now. Did we, in the end, outwit the one behind the shadows, or simply force him deeper?" Holmes gave a short laugh. "There are victories, and then there are postponements. Horn was no mastermind, but a man greedy enough to risk everything. The buyer, the architect of Ada's revenge, may never reveal himself. But Watson, a foe who fears the light must always live in dread of discovery. That is a punishment of its own." He paused, gazing into the flames. "It is often said that a great city keeps its own time. Her secrets are buried as deep as her rivers. But sometimes, when the fog lifts, we glimpse the shapes moving beneath the surface. And for a moment, the city remembers those she wronged. There was a gentleness to his words that I had rarely heard, and I realized how deeply the case had moved him, not for its puzzle alone, but for the human misery that had threaded through every clue. We passed the next hour in quiet reflection. I watched as Holmes, now more himself, penned a letter to a barrister of considerable reputation, one who had, on occasion, intervened in the fate of those swept up unjustly in the undertow of justice. I knew without asking that it concerned Ada Merrick. As night deepened, Holmes grew suddenly alert. There was a scuff at the door, a hurried knock. Mrs. Hudson entered, breathless, clutching a telegram. Holmes read it aloud. Attempt made on Ledger's evidence room, Scotland Yard. Intruder apprehended. Name, Samuel Lech, former dock foreman, employed by Beckett. Claims to have acted on instructions from anonymous benefactor. Details forthcoming. Lestrade. Holmes smiled, but there was little mirth in it. The last ripples, Watson. Lech was a blunt instrument, a man content to trade in shadows for coin. His confession will offer the courts a tidy bow, but not the full tapestry. He handed me the telegram, his mood turning introspective again. In every case, there are layers that no court will ever see, yet with vigilance, even the most cunning adversary is forced to act, and in acting, reveals himself. He fetched the ledger's duplicate, compiled from his own notes, and placed it in the fire. Let the city keep her mysteries, Watson, for now. The rest, let them stand, warned that their time in the fog is not infinite. The wind had died down outside, and a calm had settled at last. Holmes poured us both a measure of brandy, the glasses catching firelight as we sat together, silent but companionable, each of us bearing the knowledge of what had been prevented, and what must still be guarded against. I could not help but reflect on the curious chain of events. The ghostly footsteps, the widow's terror, the ledger's coded rot, and the sorrow and vengeance that followed through alley and drawing-room alike. Holmes, for all his detachment, had seen to the heart of the matter, and I, privileged as ever, had borne witness to the struggle, its cost, and its resolution. And as I closed my notebook for the night, I understood at last that London's greatest mysteries would never fully yield to daylight, but in the patient, persistent work of minds like Holmes's, there was hope that even the darkest corners might be illumined, if only for a fleeting moment. So ended the strange affair of the footsteps heard in the fog, one more shadow cast aside, for now, beneath the ever-watchful eyes of Baker Street. The hours after midnight passed in a hush, the steady tick of the mantel clock the only measure of time as Holmes and I sat wakeful in the lamplight. Rain had begun to rattle against the windows, softening the city's distant sounds to a muted thrum. I wrote a few final lines in my notebook, my thoughts circling back through the fog, the footprints, the ledger, and all the human desperation woven through the case. But even as exhaustion threatened to claim me, I could sense that Holmes had not surrendered to rest. His mind, as ever, remained vigilant, attentive to echoes most would never hear. He sat in his chair, eyes fixed not on the dying fire, but on something only he could see. The telegram from Lestrade regarding Samuel Lech lay open beside him, already memorized, every word weighed. I finally spoke, compelled by the silence. Holmes, do you truly believe the attempt on the evidence room is the final move, or is this merely another shadow in a hall of mirrors? Holmes considered for a moment, his gaze sharpening. Every crime, Watson, leaves ripples, some seen, some not. The attempt on the ledger is significant, but not unexpected. Lech is a man without ambition, driven only by need. He was hired to create confusion, to retrieve the ledger if possible, or, failing that, to test the Yard's vigilance. He steepled his fingers, his tone growing more animated as he continued. But look deeper. Why would our architect, the real mind behind this web, risk a final, reckless ploy when they must know the ledger is now out of reach? To send a message? I ventured. Precisely. It's a warning, not an act of recovery. Our adversary wishes to remind us that their reach extends further than we imagine, that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, is ever truly safe. I shivered despite the warmth. What will you do? Holmes rose and crossed to the window, peering through the rain at the lantern-lit street below. For now, we watch and wait. Lech will talk. Men of his sort always do, given time and the right pressure. In his account, we may find not just the next link, but perhaps the very voice we have yet to hear, the hand that signed his payment, the messenger who delivered it, the silent watcher who vanishes when the light appears. He turned back, his expression thoughtful. I've already dispatched a note to Lestrade, urging him to look for unusual deposits, coded messages, the faintest pattern in Lech's movements. The enemy is clever, but not infallible. Every contact leaves a trace. We fell into a contemplative silence, and I could not help but marvel at Holmes's patience, the willingness to linger in uncertainty, to resist the need for immediate answers even after so many sleepless nights. Later, as dawn crept across the rooftops, a new telegram arrived. Holmes read it aloud. Lech confessed. Payment received via anonymous courier, instructions left at Crown and Anchor Public House. Description of sender vague. Tall, foreign accent, wore gloves, face concealed by scarf. Lech claims no further knowledge. L. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A foreign element, Watson. Someone with no local ties, hired to insulate the true mind at work. The pattern repeats, distance, layers, plausible deniability. But even the most secretive network contains flaws. He placed the telegram down, then, in a rare gesture, set his hand on my shoulder. We may not catch every ghost that walks in the fog, my friend, but each step we force them to take leaves them less certain, more exposed. One day, that will be enough. I was struck by his resolve, the mixture of humility and quiet confidence that marked the best of his cases. For Holmes, victory was never final, but neither was defeat. With the sun finally breaking through the storm clouds, the city stirred anew. We breakfasted quietly. Holmes, in better spirits, read a letter of gratitude from Mrs. Beckett, who, though still shaken, had found peace knowing her late husband's secrets would no longer shadow her days. She thanked Holmes for his discretion and for helping me see that justice and vengeance are not the same. As I closed my notebook, I realized how deeply the case had changed us both. Its end was not one of triumph, but of knowledge hard won. A reminder that London's fog may lift, but its secrets remain, waiting for the day when footsteps, once heard in darkness, are brought into the light. Holmes rose, stretched, and reached for his violin. As the first notes filled the room, mingling with the soft patter of rain, I knew that, though this adventure had reached its conclusion, the city would soon whisper its next enigma. And when it did, Holmes would be ready, his mind forever attuned to the faintest footstep lost in the fog. By mid-morning, a clean, rain-washed brightness filled Baker Street, and the storm of the previous night seemed a world away. The air inside our sitting room felt different, a subtle sense of closure pressing in alongside the faint tang of Holmes's pipe tobacco and the persistent click of the telegraph key in the hallway below. Holmes, having exhausted his violin for the moment, was now bent over a stack of correspondence, occasionally pausing to jot notes in his small, neat hand. I finished a final line in my account and set the pen aside, letting the quiet settle over us. But as always in our shared life, the quiet could never last. A knock sounded at the door. Sharp, official, unmistakable. Mrs. Hudson entered, flustered, and behind her came Inspector Lestrade, face grave but not without relief. He removed his hat, nodded to us both, and accepted the seat Holmes gestured toward. "You have come for a last report, Lestrade?" Holmes asked, with that familiar half-smile which always seemed to flicker on the edge of amusement and challenge. "In a sense, Mr. Holmes. Lech has said all he will say. He's terrified, but he's no more than a runner. We've confirmed his payment came via an account in Hamburg, then routed through 3 banks before it arrived in London. There's little hope of following that trail further, I'm afraid." Holmes nodded, unsurprised. "Our adversary has buried their tracks as deep as the Ledger's secrets." Lestrade pressed on. "Nevertheless, the Crown prosecution is preparing charges against Horn and several others from the Ledger, though you were right. Pressure is already being applied from above. Tew has resigned quietly. Rusk left for the continent last night. Father Alban Stone has vanished, and frankly, I doubt we'll find him. But the courts will see Horn tried, and Ada Merrick's case is already stirring debate. Public sympathy is on her side. She'll likely be spared the full measure of the law." I felt a weight lift at that. Holmes simply nodded, his gaze unfocused, already tracking some deeper current. Lestrade paused. "If you've anything left to tell, Holmes, now is the time." Holmes considered for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. At last he spoke, his words deliberate. "Only this, Lestrade. Justice, like truth, is rarely absolute. The real author of these crimes remains in the shadows, content for now to let the dust settle. But mark my words, he will act again when new opportunity arises. You must remain vigilant." Lestrade, perhaps weary from many such warnings, smiled ruefully. "We always are, Mr. Holmes, though I sometimes think your vigilance outpaces the rest of us by half the city." Holmes's lips twitched upward. "That is merely the product of sleepless nights, Lestrade." After Lestrade's departure, Holmes allowed himself a brief, rare moment of reflection. "You see, Watson, the machinery of justice is not swift nor infallible, but it grinds on. And now, with the Ledger buried in the yard's deepest vault, London may breathe a little easier, until the next storm gathers." He crossed to the hearth, stoked the fire, then looked at me with sudden seriousness. "You must write this case, Watson. Not just for the record, but as a warning. There are always those who will walk unseen in the fog, who will prey on fear and silence. Only by shining a light, however faint, can we hope to reveal their footsteps." I promised I would, and spent the afternoon shaping the final lines of my narrative, seeking the balance Holmes always found between fact and feeling, justice and mercy. He moved about the flat with restless purpose, at one moment poring over telegrams, the next standing at the window, scanning the traffic below as though waiting for some fresh shadow to cross the threshold. As dusk fell, Holmes paused beside me. "Did you note, Watson, that none of those most powerful tried to buy their way out directly? They sent others, always others. That is the lesson. Fear of exposure is the most potent leash." I nodded. "But you loosened it, if only for a night." Holmes gave a rare, approving smile. Let us hope it was enough. Evening brought rain once more, tapping gently at the glass. Holmes sat with his pipe, gazing into the fire, lost in thought. I closed my notebook and joined him, both of us silent but content, the burden of the case finally lifting. There was a peace in that moment, a sense, perhaps illusory, that our efforts had not merely disrupted an evil, but had sent a message to all who would hide behind shadows. London would remain a city of secrets, but as long as there were eyes and minds attuned to the faintest footfall in the fog, there was hope. So ended the case of the footsteps heard in the fog. And as the fire burned low, I realized that while Holmes would always seek the next mystery, I would always bear witness, pen in hand, as London whispered its secrets just beyond the glow of our hearth. As the rain thinned to a mist and Baker Street's windows glowed gold in the lamplight, Holmes and I sat together before the fire, our silhouettes thrown long and quiet across the floor. There was a stillness in the room, a kind of earned tranquility after weeks spent navigating fog and fear, ambition and betrayal. I found myself reviewing the trail of clues, marveling at how even the faintest of details, an oiled gate, a vanished ledger, footsteps lost in mist, could unravel a web so intricate and perilous. Holmes, always restless when a case reached its final chord, at last spoke, voice low and meditative. "You see, Watson, the solution rested not in the strength of the alibis or the cunning of our adversaries, but in the very nature of their fear. The guilty flee not only from justice, but from the memory of their own misdeeds. Beckett's ledger was never merely a record. It was a ledger of dread. And the footsteps Mrs. Beckett heard that night were the ghostly echo of every secret those pages contained." I glanced at him, struck as ever by the ease with which he wove logic into insight. And yet, Holmes, it was not just guilt that moved them, but opportunity. Jasper Horn wished to seize the ledger, not to destroy it, but to wield it as Beckett once had, to make himself king of London's shadows. Holmes nodded. Exactly so. Horn was the spider at the center of the web, but he overreached. His scheme, brilliant as it was, depended on too many accomplices, too many frightened souls eager to save themselves. In the end, it was Ada Merrick's desperation, her willingness to step from pawn to avenger, that forced the game into the open. The mastermind's greatest error was to imagine he could direct every player and remain unseen. But fear is a poor instrument, Watson. It breeds recklessness. I considered Ada's fate, her grief and her courage, manipulated by the promise of vengeance. And she, Holmes, was justice truly served for her? He was silent for a moment, the firelight flickering in his sharp eyes. For Ada, justice must be tempered with mercy. She was driven by loss, wielded by others as a weapon, yet in her confession, she offered us the key. By stepping into the fog, she unwittingly exposed the shape of the hand guiding her. It was her error and her bravery that allowed us to pierce the final veil. A sudden hush filled the room. I realized that, for the first time, the terror had truly receded. Holmes rose and moved to the window, peering out at the rain-slicked street. The footsteps in the fog, Watson, the very motif of this case, were never merely sounds in the night. They were the sign of secrets closing in, of guilt desperate to remain hidden. Every shadow that haunted Mrs. Beckett's home, every whisper in the alleyways, was but a fragment of the city's great, uneasy conscience. He turned back to me, the hint of a smile at his lips. "In chasing those echoes, we have done what little men may. The powerful may escape unscathed for a time, and new shadows will always grow where old ones are dispelled. But so long as there are minds willing to listen, to question, to see, there is hope that truth will out." I sat in companionable silence as Holmes drew the curtains and poured 2 glasses of brandy. We toasted not to victory, but to the strange and necessary business of seeking light in the fog. And so, as the night deepened and London lay calm at last, I set down the final words of my chronicle. The mystery of the footsteps had been solved, its perpetrators unmasked, and those left behind given what comfort and justice we could afford. Sherlock Holmes, ever vigilant, had reminded the city and me that no secret remains forever in the shadows, and that every echo in the night is but the herald of a truth longing to be heard. Thus concluded the case of the footsteps, heard in the fog, and with it another chapter in the annals of Baker Street, where the light never quite surrenders to the darkness, and where hope, though fragile, walks on.